The wind moves first. It travels across the Lassithi Plateau in long, uninterrupted currents, passing over low stone walls and scattered olive trees, brushing against the dry grass with a sound that is almost like breath. There is very little else here. No dense settlements, no constant movement, just elevation, distance, and the quiet persistence of time. And then, beneath that stillness, there is a cave. The entrance to the Hagia Charalambos Cave does not announce itself. It sits low against the earth, partially obscured, as though the island has been trying to forget it. When archaeologists first entered, the air inside was cool, preserved, separate from the heat outside. A different climate, a different rhythm, and deeper within, they found them. Skulls, dozens of them, 37 individuals placed together, their bones arranged and layered in ways that suggested ritual, not accident. They had been here for nearly 4,000 years, waiting, not for discovery exactly, but for interpretation. At first glance, the assumption was simple. It had already been decided long before the cave was opened. These people, whoever they were, could not have been from here. They must have come from somewhere else, because everything about the civilization they were linked to suggested distance, influence, arrival, not origin. That assumption had a history. It can be traced back to a single figure, a man standing among ruins trying to reconstruct a world from fragments. Arthur Evans arrived on Crete at the turn of the 20th century and began excavating what would become one of the most iconic archaeological sites in Europe, Knossos. He did not just uncover walls, he uncovered something that felt even then out of place. Corridors painted with dolphins that seemed to move across plaster as though still alive. Chambers arranged with a precision that suggested administration, not chaos. Storage rooms lined with vast clay jars, each one part of a system that implied organization on a scale Europe was not supposed to have reached yet, and at the center of it all, the so-called throne room. A stone seat flanked by painted griffins, positioned within a chamber that felt ceremonial, deliberate, almost theatrical. It did not resemble what Evans expected from an early European society, so he looked elsewhere. He saw echoes of Egypt in the art, the fluidity of the figures, the confidence of the line. He noted similarities with North African burial forms. He compared motifs, postures, fragments of design, and from those comparisons, he constructed a theory. This civilization, he believed, had not begun here. It had arrived. In his view, the people who built Knossos were migrants, a foreign elite, carriers of culture from more established centers of civilization, likely from Egypt or the North African coast. They had crossed the Mediterranean, settled on Crete, and brought sophistication with them. It was not a minor suggestion. It became the framework. For decades, it shaped everything that followed, because it solved a problem. If a civilization appeared too advanced for its supposed environment, then the simplest explanation was that it had not truly emerged there at all. It had been imported. And so the Minoans, as Evans named them, became a kind of anomaly explained through migration. A maritime people, yes, but not indigenous, not rooted, not local. The bones in the cave were interpreted through that lens. They were assumed to belong to outsiders, and yet, the more the ruins were studied, the more the scale of what had been built became difficult to reconcile with that narrative alone. Knossos was not an isolated palace. It was part of a network, a maritime system that extended across the Aegean. Trade routes connecting Crete to the Cyclades, to Anatolia, to the Levant. Goods moved, ideas moved, art moved, but movement does not always imply origin. The Minoans controlled this network, their ships, their ports, their ceramics found far beyond the island itself. Octopus motifs painted with an observational accuracy that suggested familiarity with the sea, not borrowed symbolism. Bull-leaping frescoes capturing motion mid-flight, as though the artist understood not just the form, but the physical reality of the act. This was not imitation, it was expression, and still the assumption persisted until the question changed. Not where did the art come from, but where did the people come from? That question required a different kind of evidence, one that had not been available to Evans, one that did not depend on interpretation, it depended on biology. In 2013, a team of geneticists returned to the cave on the Lassithi Plateau. Not physically at first, but through the remains that had been recovered decades earlier, teeth, bone fragments, material that under the right conditions might still preserve something far more fundamental than artifacts, DNA. The challenge was considerable. The Mediterranean climate is not kind to genetic material. Heat accelerates decay. Time erases sequences. Contamination is always a risk. Extracting ancient DNA from these remains required precision. Clean rooms, controlled environments, every step monitored to prevent modern genetic material from interfering with what little remained of the ancient sequences. They focused on mitochondrial DNA, passed through the maternal line, more resilient, more likely to survive. The process was slow, grinding fragments of tooth, isolating molecules, amplifying what could be recovered, watching as sequences, incomplete and fragile, began to emerge. Each sequence represented a lineage, a haplogroup, a trace of ancestry that could be compared against known populations, both ancient and modern. The expectation, shaped by a century of scholarship, was clear. If Evans had been correct, the genetic signal would point south, toward Egypt, toward North Africa, toward some external origin that explained the sudden appearance of complexity on Crete. At first, there was uncertainty, then pattern, and then something far more difficult to ignore. The sequences did not align with North African haplogroups. They did not cluster with Egyptian populations. There was no meaningful genetic signal pointing across the southern Mediterranean. Instead, the data moved in another direction, north and west, toward Neolithic Europe. The closest matches were not foreign elites from distant civilizations, but early European farmers, populations that had spread from Anatolia into the Aegean thousands of years before the Minoan palaces were ever constructed. The implication was immediate and deeply unsettling to the existing narrative. The Minoans were not outsiders. They were indigenous. Not in a simplistic sense, but in a genetic one. Descendants of people who had already been on Crete for millennia, farmers, settlers, communities that had arrived during the Neolithic expansion and remained adapting, developing, evolving in place. The maritime masters of the Bronze Age were biologically the continuation of much earlier lineages, local people who had done something extraordinary. The reversal was complete. A theory that had dominated for over a century was not adjusted. It was contradicted. And yet, the answer created a new question. If they were local, why did everything about them feel so different? Because the further one looks, the less familiar they become. There is a silence at the center of their world that refuses to resolve. It exists not in their architecture, which can be measured, or in their trade, which can be mapped, but in something more fundamental, their language. Across Crete, archaeologists uncovered tablets, hundreds of them, clay surfaces impressed with symbols arranged in careful sequences, repetition without comprehension, structure without translation. The script is known as Linear A. It looks organized, intentional. It carries all the hallmarks of a functioning administrative system, lists, inventories, perhaps names, perhaps rituals. But no one has ever been able to read it. Linguists have spent decades attempting to unlock it. They compare the signs to later scripts. They analyze frequency patterns. They isolate recurring clusters. They test hypothetical phonetic values. Nothing holds. Unlike Linear B, which was eventually deciphered and revealed to encode an early form of Greek, Linear A resists every approach. It does not map cleanly onto any known Indo-European language. It does not align with Semitic structures. It does not resemble anything that can be confidently placed within the linguistic families of Europe. It is not just unread, it is anomalous. This is where the contradiction deepens. The DNA suggests continuity, a lineage that connects the Minoans to Neolithic Europeans to early farmers who spread across the continent thousands of years earlier. But the language suggests isolation, a system that appears disconnected as though it emerged independently or persisted from a much older substrate that has since vanished. A genetic lineage that is familiar, a linguistic identity that is not. It is here that the idea of a ghost population begins to take shape. Not a population that never existed, but one that no longer exists in a recognizable form. A lineage that reached a peak, left traces, and then was absorbed, diluted, or erased through time. The Minoans begin to resemble something transitional, not the origin of a system, but a moment within a longer, largely invisible continuum. There are parallels. In the Sahara, long before it became the desert known today, there were communities living in regions that are now uninhabitable. At a site known as Takarkori Rock Shelter, archaeologists uncovered mummified remains dating back 7,000 years. When their DNA was analyzed, it revealed a lineage that does not exist in an unaltered form anywhere today. It was not entirely foreign to modern populations, but it was distinct, a branch that had diverged, persisted, and then disappeared as a coherent genetic identity, absorbed into later populations, broken apart through admixture, present only as fragments. In South America, a similar pattern emerged. Ancient remains from what is now Colombia carried genetic signatures that do not match any known modern population. No direct descendants, no clear continuity. Just a presence, followed by absence. History records cultures through material remains, through written accounts when they exist. But genetics reveals something quieter. Entire lineages can fade, not through sudden extinction, but through gradual integration, layer upon layer of migration, intermarriage, replacement, until what was once distinct becomes indistinguishable. The Minoans fit this pattern. Their genetic signal does not vanish entirely, but it does not remain intact either. Later populations on Crete, Mycenians, and then successive waves of settlers, introduced new genetic material, each layer altering the composition, diluting the original signal without fully erasing it. What remains is not a direct continuation, but a trace, a lineage that is still there, but no longer isolated enough to define a people. And yet, the cultural distinction of the Minoans suggests that, at their height, they were something more than just another regional variation of Neolithic descendants. They were different, not in origin, but in outcome, which raises a question that the DNA cannot answer. What allowed this particular lineage, on this particular island, to develop into something so singular? The scientific community approaches this question with caution. Ancient DNA, especially in the Mediterranean, is difficult to obtain. Heat degrades genetic material, moisture accelerates decay. Many samples yield nothing usable. The ones that do represent only a fraction of the original population. The 2013 study relied on remains from a single location, one cave, one region of Crete, 37 individuals. It is enough to establish a pattern, but not enough to capture the full diversity of a civilization that spanned centuries and multiple centers of activity. Crete is not uniform. The eastern regions differ from the western. Coastal communities differ from those inland. Trade hubs would have attracted different influences than isolated settlements. Whether the individuals from Hagia Charalambos represent the entire Minoan population is not something the data can confirm. There is also the question of time. The remains analyze date to a specific period within the broader Minoan timeline. But the civilization itself did not appear suddenly with the construction of palaces. It developed over generations, pre-palatial communities, early settlements, phases of growth that remain largely unrepresented in the genetic record. It is possible that earlier populations carried slightly different genetic compositions. It is possible that changes occurred over time that are not yet visible. The data is precise, but it is incomplete. And so, while the conclusion that the Minoans were indigenous to Crete is strongly supported, the finer details of how their lineage evolved remain open to interpretation. What is not in dispute is the direction of the evidence. The theory of a North African or Egyptian origin does not align with the genetic data. Minoans did not arrive as a foreign elite. They emerged from within. The mystery, then, is not where they came from. It is how they became what they were, and how they ceased to be. Because by the mid-2nd millennium BCE, something begins to shift. The archaeological record shows a change in material culture. New forms appear, new administrative systems. A different script begins to replace Linear A. That script is Linear B, and it can be read. It records an early form of Greek. This is the moment when another population enters the story. It does not arrive with a single event. There is no clear line where one world ends and another begins. No layer of ash that marks an invasion, no singular moment of rupture. Instead, the change unfolds gradually, almost quietly, as though the island itself is adjusting to a new presence. From the mainland, across the Aegean, the people we now call the Mycenians begin to appear within the material record of Crete. At first, it is subtle, pottery styles, decorative shifts, small variations in form that suggest influence rather than replacement. Trade, perhaps, contact, exchange. But influence accumulates. Over time, the administrative heart of the island begins to change. At Knossos, the script of record transitions. The tablets that once carried the silent symbols of Linear A are replaced by Linear B, a system that encodes a recognizable Greek language. This is not just a linguistic shift, it is structural. The palace, once an expression of a distinct Minoan system, becomes something else. An administrative center operating within a broader Mycenian framework. The architecture remains, but the function adapts. The symbols persist, but their meaning changes. Genetically, the process mirrors what is seen in the artifacts. The incoming populations are not entirely foreign. They share deep ancestry with the Minoans, tracing back to the same Neolithic expansions from Anatolia into the Aegean. But there is an addition, a component associated with populations further north, often described as steppe-related ancestry, which had spread into mainland Greece during the Bronze Age. When these groups establish themselves on Crete, they do not replace the existing population outright. They layer over it. The result is admixture, a blending of lineages. The original Minoan genetic signature becomes part of a more complex whole, its distinct boundaries softening with each generation. Culturally, traces remain. Religious practices continue, though often reinterpreted. Iconography persists in altered forms. Sites of ritual significance remain active even as administrative systems shift. But the coherence of the Minoan identity begins to dissolve, not abruptly, but steadily. Then, something larger intervenes. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the late Bronze Age collapses. Trade networks that had connected distant regions for centuries begin to fail. Coastal settlements are abandoned or reduced. Systems that depended on long-distance exchange become unsustainable. Crete is not isolated from this. The palatial centers decline. Administrative complexity gives way to fragmentation. The elaborate frescoes are no longer renewed. The corridors fall silent. Population patterns shift toward defensible highland locations. Simpler forms of material culture replace the intricacy of earlier periods. The civilization does not vanish in a single moment. It recedes. What had once been central becomes peripheral. What had once been unified becomes dispersed. And over time, the name Minoan ceases to correspond to a living identity. It becomes a category, an archaeological designation applied retrospectively to a people who did not leave behind a name for themselves that we can read. Their language remains undeciphered, their administrative records silent, their internal structure, whether ruled by kings, councils, or something else entirely, still debated. What survives are fragments. A fresco of a figure suspended above a charging bull, captured at the precise moment between contact and release. Ceramic vessels painted with marine life rendered in fluid, almost observational detail. Architectural spaces that suggest movement, ceremony, and control, but do not fully explain themselves. And beneath all of it, the genetic record. A set of sequences recovered from a cave on a plateau, from individuals who lived and died long before the final transformations of the island. Those sequences answered a question that had persisted for over a century. They established that the Minoans were not outsiders, they were indigenous, descended from the early farming populations that had settled Crete thousands of years earlier, connected to the broader Neolithic expansion that shaped the genetic landscape of Europe. But in answering that question, the DNA exposed another. If they were local, then their uniqueness cannot be explained by origin. It must be explained by development, by choices, adaptations, interactions, and conditions that allowed a particular lineage in a particular place to produce something that still feels distinct even now. The genetic data can trace lineage, it can map ancestry, it can identify relationships between populations across time, but it cannot reconstruct belief. It cannot translate language. It cannot explain why linear A remains unreadable while linear B yields its meaning. It cannot tell us what the people who built Knossos thought about themselves or how they understood the world they inhabited. And so, the cave remains. The Hagia Charalambos Cave still holds the bones of individuals whose identities have been partially recovered and partially lost. Their mitochondrial haplogroups place them within a known framework of human migration. Their physical remains confirm their presence within a specific time and place. But beyond that, there is silence, a silence that is not empty, but unresolved. Because to know where a people came from is not the same as knowing who they were. The wind still crosses the plateau. It moves over the same ground, passes the same entrance, carries no memory of the interpretations that have changed over the past century, the theories that rose and fell, the assumptions that were made and then undone. Inside the cave, the arrangement of bones has not changed. They remain where they were placed. 4,000 years ago, a community made a decision about how to treat their dead. They selected this space. They returned to it. They left behind a pattern that suggests meaning, but does not reveal it. Modern science has reached into that space and extracted something measurable, a lineage, a connection, a correction to a long-held belief. But it has not emptied the cave of its mystery. If anything, it has deepened it. Because the question is no longer how a foreign people brought civilization to Crete. It is how a local population, rooted in the earliest layers of European prehistory, became something so culturally distinct that even now, with all the tools available, it resists full understanding. The answer is not in a single dataset. It is not in a single excavation. It may not even be in Crete alone. It exists somewhere between biology and culture, between continuity and transformation, between what survives and what disappears. And for now, it remains where it has always been, waiting, not for discovery, but for interpretation that is finally equal to the evidence.